Hey everyone, it's Sevi. As part of my videos on Kazuha's rerun, I chose to make a video that focuses specifically on answering the question, what is Kazuha's best weapon? And I'm doing this because I've noticed it's a contentious point when it comes to building Kazuha. I've seen many points raised about why this weapon is better than that weapon or this weapon. So by doing a focused discussion on this topic, I'll be able to give a detailed explanation on each of Kazuha's weapon options, as well as what I think his top choices are. It's going to be quite a long video since I want to make the discussion comprehensive, so get ready and let's plunge right in. Before getting to the weapons, I'll first establish these important points. 1. We're discussing an EM build Kazuha, not an attack crit build Kazuha. A full VV EM build for me is the best and simplest way to combine support utility and damage output. I do acknowledge how some people build a crit Kazuha, and so if that's what you're only interested in, this video won't apply to that. 2. You ought to be familiar with how Kazuha's kit works, in particular, how his buff works in relation to EM. In summary, Kazuha's biggest support utility is that aside from being a VV Animo Shredder and crowd controller, he gives your team an elemental damage bonus by swirling that particular element, and this damage bonus scales on how much EM he has. This is why EM on him makes him do stronger reaction damage plus give a stronger damage buff. 3. We also understand that Kazuha's energy recharge and his ability to have his burst ready every rotation are important. And Kazuha needs ample ER for very often being the only Animo unit in a team. And without having his energy needs met, that affects your rotations and limits Kazuha's damage and swirling potential. You might see Kazuha showcases with 1000 EM builds, but do they have enough ER too? Those may be meant to do big damage showcases, but are more impractical in general combat use. 4. We're assuming that players have a C0 Kazuha, but I'll still make some notes for considerations of a C1 Kazuha since he gets a skill cooldown reset, which means more particle generation. 5. This isn't a simple side-by-side damage test, as we're doing a more comprehensive analysis on the practical gameplay effects, build advantages, and added utility these weapons provide. 6. And most importantly, this is meant to help you understand how to work with what you have and know your options better. It is in no way pressuring you to build Kazuha in one exact way. With those points clear, we can now proceed to the weapon discussion. Narrowing it down, you'll come up with the following list of weapon choices. You'll notice that you can divide them into two camps, EM weapons versus ER weapons. This is the first consideration, whether you run an ER or EM weapon, and this will also affect the stats in his artifact builds. Kazuha's burst and ER are essential to his function, and he needs about 160 to 190% ER, which fluctuates depending on factors like team energy generation, number of enemies, or external particle sources to reliably burst every rotation. While there are potential teams and situations that allow for a lower ER on Kazuha, those can be quite limiting rather than making Kazuha more adaptable. That's why having a high ER is just a safer target for better general use. This is just as important to pay attention to as his EM stat. So how can you achieve that amount of ER? If you run an EM weapon, you will have to find ER from artifacts, which will require a total of about 11 to 16 substats worth of ER. However, that's generally difficult to attain via artifact substats alone unless you're just that incredibly lucky. And so it will most likely be achieved via a combination of an ER Sans, which gives you about 9 ER substats worth already, and the remaining needed ER can be more realistically acquired from artifact substats. On the other hand, if you run an ER weapon, then that allows you to get any remaining ER you need from substats, and you can switch to an EM Sans instead. At C1, Kazuha can get away with less ER, but that doesn't mean you can just completely forget about ER requirements and just go EM weapon, EM Sans all the way. Basically, address Kazuha's ER first, whether through his artifacts or weapons. But going deeper, let's now take a look at each weapon to see if they have more specific benefits aside from the EM or ER substat. Starting off with the usable but least recommended among the choices. We have the cheapest 3-star options, Dark Iron Sword and Skyrider Sword, with EM and ER substats respectively. They're both usable if you really have no other better options, but by virtue of being 3-star weapons, weapons giving generally low stats, they're noticeable downgrades. Unsurprisingly, we're placing them at the bottom ring. The Festering Desire is also viable if you really have no other ER option. The ER it gives is on the lower side, and the passive effect isn't that useful for Kazuha, so it's also among the least recommended. The Skyward Blade as a 5-star weapon gives a high base attack, but that's not as important in this case, and gives 55% ER, which is a good amount. It has a couple of effects, like giving some crit rate, increasing the user's speed, and giving an attack base damage proc. But again, these aren't as important for Kazuha's purpose and so end up being largely wasted. On these points, it's okay, but it also ends up being less recommended even if it's a 5-star sword. Next up is the Freedom Sworn, his supposed signature weapon. Right now, I'll say that by its own virtue, Freedom Sworn is a great weapon for Kazuha. It gives the highest EM, gives its wearer a damage bonus, and its team buff effect gives Kazuha an added damage buff mechanic on top of his innate buff. If you're concerned about achieving the highest damage per screenshot in teams with Kazuha, the Freedom Sworn can easily be the weapon for that. It's worth noting though that the triggered effect gives normal charge plunging damage bonus and attack percent bonus. Generally, this is usable by DPSs that Kazuha supports, but remember that some units won't be able to take full advantage of this buff. I'll show some examples on screen and why. So yes, again it is a great weapon, but how good it is has to be balanced with it being a gacha weapon that you may have to spend a lot of primos on. It's viewed by many as his best in slot, but only a few can viably equip it too. And so it becomes a question of, is it really that worth pulling if you have limited primos and if compared to other 4-star alternatives? Personally, I don't think it's worth pulling. Of course, I won't tell you not to pull for it if you really want to or if money's no issue, but for me those primos could have been spent on other weapons that may be more significant upgrades to their respective users, like a Mistsplitter Reforged or Staff of Homa, or even on characters or constellations that can have a bigger impact, like trying to eventually aim for C0 Kazuha that's a bigger team buff. But largely, it's because you have these next 4-star weapons that offer better value for money. Now, the Iron Sting is the free-to-play craftable weapon that essentially is the budget version of Freedom Sworn. It gives decent base attack, decent EM, and has an elemental damage buffing effect that can give a small boost to Kazuha's Anemo and elemental infused damage. The fact that it costs only a billet to craft and upgrade resources means that your primos are safe and you can settle for this. I'm sure many would consider this as their go-to weapon for Kazuha, and for a while I also stuck with it in my earlier days with him. The triggered effect is straightforward to use. Really, it's such a simple weapon that suits Kazuha's wants, and there's very little else to say. However, this is where I come in to preach the ER and Favonius agenda, because we have 2 other 4-star weapons that are a cut above the Iron Sting due to their increased utility and potentially overall better damage output. Meet the Sacrificial Sword and Favonius Sword. As you can see, both give the same base attack and the highest ER stat of any weapon. So why do I think these ER weapons are better choices? For reference, 61% ER is worth about 11 ER substat rolls already. Using these weapons practically means giving Kazuha almost all or even all the ER he'll need for consistent burst uptime. That would then mean being able to use an EM Sans, which at 5-star max level is 187 EM, about 9 subs worth. If we compare the stat value to Iron Sting, the Iron Sting gives 165 EM, 8 subs worth. That's less than an EM Sans. Then, to compensate for Kazuha's ER, you'd use an ER Sans or get the equivalent via substats, which at 51.8% is 9 substats worth, which is also less than what the Sac and Fab Sword provide. So going for the ER weapon plus EM Sans totals to 20 substats, while the Iron Sting plus ER Sans combo totals 17 substats worth. So, in effect, you're getting about 3 substats more value with the ER weapon EM Sans combo. One might say, though, once we take into consideration their effects, Iron Sting gives slightly higher base attack and elemental damage bonus, but that small base attack increase and elemental damage bonus will only very marginally affect Kazuha's non-swirl damage, and with an EM Kazuha build, that's a smaller damage source than his swirls. But here's one thing to realize, an Iron Sting will also require significantly more ER than a Sac Sword or Fab Sword build, since those 2 weapons have extra energy generation mechanics built into them, so totaling it all-out, Iron Sting actually ends up having less leeway for offensive stats and requiring more ER stats to build. Since the Fav Sword and Sac Sword have lower ER requirements, you can aim for more offensive artifact substats, which can, in theory, equalize or even overtake the Iron Sting's offensive benefits. Let's now discuss the further benefits and caveats of the Sac Sword and Fav Sword, and I'll also address potential counter-arguments against using them. The Sac Sword gives Kazuha the ability to use his skill twice in a row by doing skill damage and proccing its effect. By doing that, you're also increasing his personal damage, which competes with the damage increase Iron Sting can give. By doing his skill twice, you also generate twice the amount of animal particles, which means that you can better guarantee his burst is ready on cooldown and give an extra tiny amount of residual energy to your party members. Also, it's more pogo stick fun and added crowd control utility. Now, the frequently asked questions will be, 1. Isn't it bad that it will make Kazuha spend more field time? This does extend Kazuha's field time by a couple of seconds, but generally, you'll be using this during your DPS unit's downtimes and thus won't be such a huge DPS loss. And it can be worth trading the extended rotation time for energy comfort. 2. Is this bad at R1 because of the high cooldown and low proc chance? Is it only viable at high refines? Of course, it's true that it becomes better with refinements, with respect to its cooldown as well. At R1, unfortunately, its cooldown is 30 seconds, which limits the proccing frequency to once every 2 rotations. This is overcome at R3 and above, so that it can now be procced every rotation. But regarding the proc chance itself, even at R1 with 40% proc chance, it won't be as bad considering Kazuha is facing multiple enemies, and thanks to his AoE abilities, doing multiple hits gives Kazuha a better chance to proc the effect. In a rotation, Kazuha will usually cast his skill 2 times, so he'll also have at least 2 chances to proc it. The low proc chance does become more disadvantageous if you're only facing a single boss, but let's say that in one rotation you don't proc the effect. Then it's not the end of the world, because that doesn't change the fact that thanks to the weapon, you still have a lot of ER to help with Kazuha's energy needs, and you can always just proc it in the next rotation. 3. Isn't it better to just give this to Xingqiu? That is true. If you have no spare copy or alternative, Xingqiu can be the higher priority user of this weapon. The Sac Sword's effect is also somewhat redundant if you already have C1 Kazuha, but for most who will only have C0 Kazuha, the Sac Sword is a very good option. Given all that, the superior weapon is none other than the Favonius Sword. The Favonius series is really that good, and I even made a video about it that you can check out later. Its effect gives a chance to generate white particles upon a crit hit. The proc rate starts at 60% at R1 to 100% at R5. I believe this is better than the Sac Sword for the following reasons. First, white particles give better energy returns for the entire team. This makes Kazuha a more valuable support by becoming a team battery. I've discussed this in so many previous videos, the importance of ER, and there's a very good chance the average player's teams would benefit a lot from that added energy generation. Your team with Fav Kazuha has either 2 scenarios regarding their energy needs. 1, the party members already have enough ER for their rotation without Kazuha's added Favonius energy particles. In that case, you could actually get away with switching some of their ER for offensive stats, which potentially increases your overall team DPS. Or your build stats don't change, in which case, Kazuha's Fav particles provide more comfort to your team's energy needs. It's a win-win either way. 2, the party members don't have enough ER, which means your rotations aren't as smooth as they can be, which thus results in lower DPS. If your ER is just atrociously bad all throughout, then a Fav Sword won't fix that by itself. But if you're just short of some ER stats needed for a smooth rotation, the Fav Sword is a godsend solution. Another win. Additionally, I think the proc condition of Fav Sword is more favorable than the Sac Swords. Kazuha's crit can come from various sources: spamming normal attacks, AoE damage, multiple hits on enemy mobs, going up and plunging down his skill, burst cast damage, whereas the Sac Sword only comes from his skill. As such, it's also more forgiving to use on single bosses. On top of that, Fav Sword, even at R1, already has a 12-second cooldown, which allows it to be procced every rotation, unlike the Sac Sword's 30-second cooldown at R1. But the crit condition is where the biggest criticisms of the Fav Sword come into play. Let's go through the common questions and contentions. 1. The Fav Sword needs crit rate to proc, which is hard to get on artifact substats. Some would even say you need a crit rate circlet to get enough crit rate. I feel as if this issue is more exaggerated than it ought to be. So how much crit rate does Kazuha need? It's quite doable to get an average of 5 crit rate substats on Kazuha, which is like at least 1 crit rate roll per piece. And keep in mind that an offset artifact can be the one to carry good crit rolls. Let's say we can get at least 5 crit rate substats equals to about 16.5% crit rate plus his 5% base crit rate equaling 21.5% crit rate. That's already pretty good enough. Of course, the more crit substats you get at little to no cost of other useful substats, the better. For me, I was able to farm an EM set with 30+% crit rate on my Kazuha, which is more than enough. Yet, even with much lower crit rate stats, the Fav Sword can still reliably crit, especially against enemy mobs. Again, Kazuha has a lot of opportunities to proc crits due to his AoE kit and multi-hit combos. And at worst, if it happens that you don't proc it with a skill, plunge, or burst, you might just have to quickly spam normals. 2. The Fav Sword isn't good enough at R1 because of the 60% proc chance on top of the crit chance needed. While refines are always welcome, a 60% chance to proc on crit is fairly high. Again, Kazuha has multiple chances to proc crits as stated before with just low crit rate, which means multiple chances to also proc the effect. The Fav Sword is perfectly usable even at R1. 3. The Fav Sword is a DPS loss rather than just using the Iron Sting. It's quite the opposite actually. As mentioned in a previous section, the Fav Sword combo can potentially overtake the Iron Sting combo substats since you can run more offensive substats rather than ER substats, which could cause it to equalize or deal more damage. But that's on top of the fact that the Fav Sword can even be a team DPS increase due to you achieving smooth rotations or letting you trade ER to offensive stats on your party members' builds. Another general criticism is that Fav Sword and Sac Sword's effects can't proc against shielded enemies you can't deal damage to, which is also true, but that's a rarer scenario than the general mobs you fight anyway. While there seem to be these caveats to get the Fav Sword working, the benefit from its effect is well worth the conditions to make Kazuha just an overall better team support in any team he's in. Even at R1, it's just that good. And again, at worst, if the Favonius effect does not proc in a rotation, then it's not a big deal. I think the worst impact will be mainly in Spiral Abyss and that it could significantly affect your clear time. In that case, simply restart the chamber. You unfortunately get none of these very useful effects if you only stick with the Iron Sting. At the end of the day, it's still a decent weapon, but there are just simply better alternatives, and that's why I'm a big believer of Fav Kazuha supremacy. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the whole debate of Kazuha's best weapons. I actually was supposed to make this a section of my overall Kazuha guide, but then I realized just how much there was to discuss and decided to make this its own dedicated video. I hope it was comprehensive but clear enough to help you come to a decision on how to build your Kazuha. Comment down below what you think of Kazuha's weapon options and let me know if this video changed your mind in any way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already for more Genshin Impact guides and content, and I will see you all soon. Take care!